I'm totally afraid. I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of losing. I'm afraid of being humiliated. But I'm totally confident. The closer I get to the ring, the more confidence I get. The closer, I'm more confident.
The new definition of confidence. Confidence is the willingness to try.
My confidence comes from both my faith and in the fact that I keep promises I make to myself.
Borrow confidence from the past.
Confidence.
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 So, hello, and thank you for joining us for Reframing Resistance to Change in Your Organization. I'm Lynn Slattery, Director of Open Enrollment Programs at Texas Executive Education at the McCombs School of Business. Along with my colleagues, we put together this webinar series to stay connected with our education family. While we miss being on the 40 acres, we recognize that learning should never stop and wanted to ensure a way to continue to bring our thought leaders to you. Before we get started, we'll cover just a few housekeeping items. All of you did enter the webinar with your cameras disabled and your microphones muted. While we would love to see and interact with all of you, we have had hundreds of people coming into these webinars, so it is just simply not possible. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available for future viewing. While we are in the webinar, though, we do want to hear from you. So please locate your Q&A tab on your webinar toolbar and use this window to ask questions during the presentation. Please don't wait until the end to post your questions. We want to make sure that they're coming in, because if you see someone else's question, you say, that's a great question, I really hope that one gets answered, please use the thumbs up to upvote it, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. You are able to raise a virtual hand, but we ask that you don't use that. We ask you to use the Q&A section for this. So we will not be following things in the chat box for that. We will just be following Q&A. Sarah Abrams, our production manager, will be monitoring this throughout the webinar, and she'll hold all the questions for our presenter until the end, and we'll get to just as many as possible. Now it is my pleasure to introduce your presenter, Dr. Katie Pritchett. Dr. Katie Pritchett empowers students and clients to be innovative leaders. She achieves this through her roles as a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin and as a founding partner for Engage Leadership Consulting, LLC. She leverages years of experience in working in state government, federal government, private industry, and higher education to illustrate the power of connecting theory to practice. Dr. Pritchett holds a central belief that business tools can be used to transform lives for the benefit of society. She specializes in innovation strategy, early stage entrepreneurship coaching, change management, and organizational behavior and effectiveness. Dr. Pritchett, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. It is such a pleasure to be joined by so many of you across all time zones. So thank you for tuning in and being with us today. As you heard from Lynn, I am a faculty member at UT Austin, and I work directly with organizations on innovation and change efforts. So this reflection, this is reflected in this presentation, basically the theory to practice, if you will, and drawing on direct and real examples from organizations that I've worked with. So I am really looking forward to helping you in this reframing resistance to change in your organizations. You'll see a poll coming up soon. Since I am a faculty member, we'll do a little quick pop quiz. Best way to start class, right? Just kidding, but I can't wait to see what you think about this. Just go with that initial gut reaction. According to research, what percentage of change efforts fail to achieve their goals? Wow, I appreciate how quick and responsive you're all being. We've already at 70%. It looks like 70% reporting is what I meant, but the majority of you are choosing 70%. So you should see the results on your screen that the majority of you chose 70%. So I don't know if that was what your gut feeling is going, or if so many of you are change management experts, but that is the correct answer. According to McKinsey and Company, 70% of change efforts fail to meet their goals. What's more important than just this stat is what's behind the stat. What's behind the stat is that it's due in large part to employee resistance and failure on management and leadership side to support through this type of resistance during those difficult times. So thank you, Lynn, for launching that poll. So what we'll do is we will move forward. Now that most of you understand that 70%, when I show this slide, I generally hear a few giggles And comedians say it's only funny because it's true. So for those of you who are hitting even above 70%, the 99%, this may look quite familiar, right? We all want something to change. We can all think of something we'd want changed in our workforce or in our organization, but then who wants to actually change? And then who wants to lead the change? No one's left there. Well, clearly that's not the case. We're joined by so many of you. And so my assumption is that most of you are here because you're undergoing some kind of change or leading some kind of change in your organization. And so the goal today is to reframe and get many more people with hands raised in that middle comic strip and many more leaders in that last one. So that's what we're going to do today. Today's agenda is going to be in 3 parts. And essentially with each of the sections I'll also cover a reframe. So the first part we're going to spend our time on is why. Why do people resist change? And understanding and reframing that why. Next, we'll look at how. How does that resistance manifest? And what can you do to help categorize and reframe what that resistance looks like and feels like in your organization? And last and most importantly will be, what can you do about it? What are the tools that you have? And we'll get to that, and I'll give you several. So, and again, just to mention Q&A, please go ahead and put that in. Always happy to answer that as we get going. So, since we're talking about change and we're talking about resisting change, let's do something that my 2-year-old has perfected when he does not want to change. I want to do a little exercise with you. And if you have the ability to stand up to do this, go ahead and stand on up. What I'd like to ask you to do is to cross your arms. Just go ahead and fold your arms. I won't stand up because then I'll be out of the frame for you, but go ahead and just fold your arms and lean into that, especially if you're standing up. Just, oh yeah, I'm just crossing these arms. All right, now that you're settled in, what I really want you to do is to uncross your arms and cross them the complete opposite way, 180-degree change. So you might have to do some unfolding and some reshuffling there. I sure wish I could see you. But I've done this with live audiences before, and it is really interesting to see, hear the laughs and see the faces. So once you've uncrossed, please stay like that for a few seconds. And Lynn, you can go ahead and launch the poll. What I'd like for you to tell me is which of the following descriptions best reflects how it first felt when you had to cross the other way. How did it first feel? Aha, looks like these are starting to come in, and your responses are absolutely mirroring what my experience is in person. 82% of you said that it was uncomfortable and did not feel natural, with only 6% saying it was very comfortable and very natural. This mirrors my exact experience in doing this live with others. And I have to tell you this funny story. I was with an organization at a retreat, and this one gentleman, he crossed his arms, but then he refused to uncross and do it the exact opposite way. I noticed it, and so I asked him why he wasn't engaging in the second part of the very quick activity, and he said that he couldn't do it. He's like, one of my arms is longer than the other, and that's why I do it the other way, so I'm not even going to try because it's just not going to work. And that's not that uncommon with us to have one leg or one arm a little bit longer. It's not that uncommon. But then his colleagues joined in, and they're like, well, show us. Let's get the data. And they put his arms out, and we're looking at it. Sure enough, even though they got him to do it the opposite way, and he did it, and it was extremely uncomfortable, but he was able to do it. And it was just one of those really fun, real life experiences to see the level of resistance. This was his own body, a very silly, very quick exercise, and he wouldn't even try it because he had what he thought was a very good reason for not doing so. And so that kind of reminds me about how unfamiliar even the smallest but noticeable changes that you may ask your employees to do. So these are things that I want you to keep in mind. And that brings us to our very first reframe, the very first part of our agenda, which is, why do people resist change? Well, instead of focusing on why, although I will share some data with you on the top reasons why, the first reframe as a leader or manager that I'd like to get you to think about is empathizing. You've already hopefully empathized and are now in a really good place, with 86% of you saying that that was an uncomfortable feeling. You've already felt that. And so my hope is that you are empathizing with your employees. In fact, what's so interesting is the way that our human brain is designed is that our brains, the way they work, really explain why the immediate reaction is it's not easy to do and it's uncomfortable. The reptilian brain was developed over 300 million years ago, and the limbic brain was developed only 100 million years ago. Neocortex only 4 million years ago. What's so important is that our unconscious hidden brain is what keeps us safe in most of the things. It's what keeps us in this pattern of what's comfortable. The things that we do, most of the things that we do are unconscious. We have a schedule, we have a flow. Some people wake up in the morning and eat breakfast and drink their coffee and brush their teeth and whatever, and then others do it the exact opposite. And you don't really have to stop and think about how you're going to do it. That's your routine. I think that's why so many of us, and lots of reasons, but why so many of us, when we transition to stay home, work safe, it disrupted our everyday. It disrupted that limbic and reptilian brain of things that we were comfortable with. We rely on the neocortex for change. The way that we always do things, it feels good. So like when I said cross your arms, I didn't have to tell you what to do or which arm to use because you already have a natural way. That's what's embedded in our brains. So a change, especially when at work, will create a fight or flight response. It will help, it actually illuminates that prefrontal cortex. And that is associated directly with the other areas of the brain that control the things that we do, whether we freeze, fight, or flight. And these are the same areas in the same part of the brain that are linked with feelings of anxiety, depression, or sadness, or fatigue. We see this happening a lot. And so what I want you to know is that the change, that auto response, and the 86% of you reporting how uncomfortable that might have been with the arm crossing, that is wired in us. So the first reframe is to empathize with our employees as humans. Not that they don't like you or that they don't like the IT system you're considering or the new processes that you're considering, although there could be something there, we'll get to it in a second. But the immediate response as humans is this auto response. Speaking of auto response, one of the other things with empathize that I want you to reframe is I want you to reframe management versus employees, or the people who want the change versus the people who feel change thrust upon them. In effect, what I've seen in organizations is an immediate dichotomous setup between us versus them. Those of us who want change and those who are resisting. When we set up this dichotomy, we're further reinforcing the brain's freeze, fight, or flight. In fact, fMRI research on the brain has shown that when people feel excluded, when they feel like they are in the other category, when they've been targeted or tagged as resisting the change and therefore needing even more force, it actually sets off the same part of our brain as suffering and grief. And so it's not easy to change, period, but it's certainly not easy to change with employees who are suffering and feeling grief. And so the first reframe is empathize. Here are some of the reasons. So we have that auto response, but here are some of the most common reasons we see in organizations of why people are resisting change. The first is that they perceive more negative outcomes than positive outcomes. And that makes sense. People saying that the pain of going through it will not be worth the pleasure in the end. We hear that so much. It just can't be better. The second reason is the fear of the unknown. You might have heard the phrase, I prefer the devil I know versus the devil we don't know. And so lots of people assume the worst. The third most common reason, if I had a nickel for every time I heard, well, that's not the way we do it here. We call that the not invented here syndrome. If it wasn't invented here, then it can't be good. The last three reasons of these top six is the cost and discomfort of breaking routines. So people not only feeling uncomfortable, think about, again, the crossing the arms, but the cost and the implicit and explicit costs to change. In fact, the more resistant, the more implicit cost we tend to experience in change management processes, over budget, over schedule, those kinds of things. But the two reasons that managers often don't think about when I work with them is number 5 and number 6, incongruent team dynamics. So sometimes, an organization as a whole has a culture, has a mission and a vision. But what managers sometimes neglect, especially if it's a multi-division change, is that different teams might have different norms, and those little subcultures may have incongruent norms that may buck or resist the overall change. And so we have to be mindful about those pockets and how we bring those managers and those leaders of those subgroups and those other teams into the fold. And the last is the incongruent organizational systems. So it's reinforcement of status quo with the subsystems or the structures. So one example is to think about streamlining data reporting. Well, I worked with an organization where the CEO received a highly customized status report every week. And the information was drawn from multiple systems with an overlay of opinion and moving the data to meaning. Well, that type of manual work is what was still expected when they consolidated their IT functions. Although the consolidated IT functions provided the CEO with a dashboard that showed everything that needed to happen, sort of a red, yellow, green, if you will, of where the status was on different assignments and projects, they still wanted the report, the manual work, and those are incongruent systems. And so these are things that we see when it comes to resisting change. So we've just discussed why and empathizing. Empathize with the people who are going through it and knowing that this response can be very much automatic. Reframe number 2 is to understand how this resistance manifests. And what I prefer you to do is to think in the reframe instead of, wow, that person's really being loud and disruptive in meetings, or that person's already, not showing up for things, or instead of classifying them or those actions as bad, what I'd rather you do is to think about a reframe and categorizing those actions. So here are the categories that tend to fall out. We tend to see active or passive resistance, and those are in red because those don't tend to be good. And we can see constructive resistance. That's in green because it can be better. But as managers and leaders, I'm going to give you tools to work with all of these. But the ways that you would see some of the behaviors you might see with active resistance is specific head-on conflict in meetings, negativity, sarcasm, a meeting after the meeting where everyone just, talks about how frustrated they are, and it creates poor morale. We see absenteeism or non-compliance or non-productivity is more passive. Lots of people are like, well, how do I know that somebody's not doing those things because they actually have constructive resistance? There's some real change. And to me, what I'd like to say is that the way we can discern the difference between active and passive and constructive is someone or a subunit that is demonstrating constructive resistance can clearly and effectively communicate and pinpoint what the issues are and demonstrate willingness to engage in solutions. And this happens pretty quickly. We see that change pretty quickly. But an example might just be like a design flaw. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a Norman door, but a Norman door is a door where the handle is designed to tell you to maybe pull when the sign's designed to pull, but it's designed to look like to push. So if you have somebody in your organization, it's like there's a design flaw or there's some implications that haven't been thought through and we need to think about those, That is constructive resistance. So when you can recategorize them, not as bad individuals or bad behaviors, but just as active, passive, or constructive, then we can move into, so what can I do as a leader or manager about these? I empathize, I'm categorizing, and I need to exercise. I need to exercise the ability to move people to action. And that's where we'll spend the rest of our time today. So what can you do? There are lots of things that you can do. In the interest of time, what I want to do is prioritize the 3 that I've seen most common and actually most frequent with some of the organizations I'm currently working with when it comes to a consulting relationship. So first is recognize resistance. And you're like, yeah, we just did that. Well, let me talk to you a little bit more about it, recognizing it, and talk what are those things you can do about it. Then we have to create a sense of urgency. If any of you are familiar with Cotter's change management, that sense of urgency is one of the very first things we have to do. But sometimes we neglect to do that or to do it in an effective way, and I'll give you some tools. And third is to co-create change with a guiding coalition. So we'll get to these and dive into each one separately. First, recognizing resistance. Here's the deal. Active and passive, although they manifest differently, it is very important that the overall goal is to understand why they're doing it and then to get buy-in. Same thing for constructive, really. But with active and passive behavior, what I've noticed is that it often tends, which is why 70% of change efforts fail to meet their goals, is because it's often allowed to just exist. Because instead of empathizing and categorizing and exercising, it's just accepted. Like it's just going to be there and we're going to do it anyway. But if we don't state the behavior and its impact, we're missing an opportunity. And I will tell you what I've seen some real powerful conversations in organizations unfold is when we use those I statements. I have noticed that in meetings, the only time you speak up is to share a negative comment. The impact that's having on the team and our efforts is, and then you explain it. This is really important. You can also do the same thing in using those I statements with passive resistance. I am noticing that you are not meeting deadlines and that there's been a lack of productivity on your end. I'd like to explain the impact it's having, and I'd like for you to explain to me why and what we can do. Not assuming allows you to then empathize and get to that real core of why, because you could maybe do something about it. You could bring it right back to some of those things we talked about. Maybe it's just the fear of the unknown. Maybe it's the devil we know versus we don't know. Or maybe they really do have constructive feedback, but their brain science is just having that fight response right away. And that's what you're seeing. So again, if we have constructive resistance, then people who have constructive resistance are able to understand the enterprise effects, clearly pinpoint where they are, and are willing to immediately move to co-creation strategies. And those are the people that you want to bring right in to form your guiding coalition. And those are the people that can help you frame the story and narrative we'll talk about in just a second of creating that urgency for change. But regardless of the type of resistance you're getting, your number one goal as a leader is to not ignore it. It's to recognize it. It's to categorize it, empathize, and move forward. We've got to get that why, and we've got to get the buy-in. The second tool I mentioned to you is to create a sense of urgency, and this is underutilized in organizations. Yes, you can go through project management training, and you read, in theory, this makes sense, and then we get into our organizations and we just do. This cannot be overstated. It cannot be overstated. Your goal is to persuade key stakeholders that the status quo is no longer acceptable, that change is preferable to the current state. Okay, so how? Here are some very specific tools that you can use to create a sense of urgency for change. 1, storytelling. Storytelling is one of the most powerful things that we have as humans. The ability to create a tailored, compelling narrative around meaningful change and what is it going to do. The analogy I like to use is a burning platform. If you were out in the middle of an ocean on a really comfortable platform with all kinds of, things, maybe even think Wilson, the little volleyball that Tom Hanks had in Castaway, your platform is pretty cozy and there's one really far away, but your platform starts to burn, it's no longer going to look that good. We want to create this sense of a burning platform, that the current status quo is no longer acceptable. And even though you're not sure if you remember how to do the breaststroke, it is preferable to jump in and you will get the tools and help so we can make it across the water. So we want to create this storytelling, and it's really important to understand what matters most to each stakeholder. That's why we start with getting to the why, because we can mirror that language and use that language in our storytelling. I understand that the fear of the unknown is really difficult. But what we do know is that other organizations who have implemented this IT system have seen efficiencies in XYZ. When we experience those efficiencies, our data are showing, and then you can show a trend. So that I'm just going to skip down because I said data, relevant data. Look, even if it's bad news, we're hearing all kinds of bad news right now. We're seeing that our customers or our clients, with the economic situation right now, less revenue, loss of revenue. We're seeing customers may have different needs or may need to go somewhere. And you need to harness that data. Sugarcoating it won't do any good. In fact, open and honest communication and discussion is going to be key. You want to model the open and honesty that you'll expect from others. Carefully select your communication channels. Not all stakeholders prefer to be or receive urgent information in the same way you'd expect. One example is an organization who communicates big issues or urgencies in status reports, weekly status reports. But if you ask the organization, or like I have, what's the likelihood or the chance of confidence, the level of confidence that those important stakeholders and leaders read the status reports? Confidence was pretty low. In fact, they were like, yeah, I work really hard on those status reports, but not many people read them. And so I end up having to repeat it. And well, that's not the right communication channel. And that brings me to that last point about alignment between decisions and actions. I was working with an organization that wanted to completely eliminate email, move 100% to a Slack system for communication and archiving information. But the top level leaders and managers were still sending really important information via email. Misalignment. These tools are really important to help you audit and think about how you will create an urgency for change. The last tool that I want to discuss is co-creation. This one is so important. It harkens right back to brain science. If we feel like we're categorized as someone who does not want change, it further embeds us in our conviction that, well, then that's what we'll do. We'll fight, we'll freeze, we'll flight. People prefer the change that they create. Just think about your experience, your personal, professional. If you feel like you are creating the change, when we solve a problem on our own, we get this natural high. It feels really good. And I can even see this manifesting for those of you, any parents out there, you might have seen this with your children, really trying to like untie a knot, or there's just this rush. And so we want to give people the opportunity to create their own change that they see and how they can be a part of it. Co-creation is really important. We can get people's buy-in. We can put them on committees. It's really important to think about co-creation. Now, we've been talking about managing resistance to change as if we are in the midst or just about to implement some kind of innovation strategy or change strategy. But I would like to put in a request for you as a leader and manager to think about co-creation as an ongoing strategy, a mindset shift, if you will, because these things are, if we can do it on the front end and embed it throughout our processes, we'll see a big difference. We can learn a lot about this mindset shift from the company Lego. Lego used to have a well-established policy of how they decided which of their new models that they would create. But Lego then launched something called the Ideas website. And the Ideas website is an excellent example of a co-creation platform. Lego, instead of setting customers, the us versus them, we create the toys and the Legos and you buy and build them. Instead, it was like, hey, let's not do an us versus them. Let's be on the same page. And they invited Lego enthusiasts to come up with models and sets that they would like to see. On this Ideas website, if the design got upvoted by 10,000 votes, speaking about upvoting, feel free to do that in the Q&A, then this would go through the review process internally to Lego to figure out if marketers and designers could make that product viable. There's one Lego enthusiast who's made, you get like a 1% royalty on the net sales. There's one Lego enthusiast who's earned over $30,000. He was avid bird watcher, and he created a model for a robin, a blue jay, and a hummingbird. What's interesting, though, is that other companies are doing this. We see it all the time. We see it with Apple, Google, IKEA, Nike, Starbucks, where consumers are no longer, it's us, the company, versus consumers who use and process, but there's co-creation of what this looks like and what we want. You can do this with your employees and embed this into your internal processes so that when a change comes, you already feel like you're on the same page and already a part of the same team. That reminds me, one of the things I like to do in a reframe is to stop thinking about people as challenging the change. And maybe they're just guarding something, but how can we move them to champions for change? Research that examines people who champion change show 3 sets of characteristics. That a champion's perspective is that when change occurs, they have autonomy to be able to have freedom in sharing clearly and articulately where that change can happen and how they might be able to be a part of it. That goes back again to brain science and co-creation. So if people already feel valued in an organization, they're more likely to champion. Second is competence. They view this opportunity, even though the change may be uncomfortable and difficult, they view it as a professional development opportunity. I will tell you this. I have taught for 11 years, and it wasn't until March of this year where I was like, whoops, guess I have to figure out how to teach virtually. And that was and I'm still learning. I'm learning new tools and new techniques every day, and it's exhausting, but it is fun. It's fun to be challenged again and being put back in the seat of the learner, and that's a champion perspective. And the last is a champion views change as an opportunity to build community within the organization, internally and externally, rather than to set up an entrenchment camp of resisting. But there's an opportunity to build more community, build more camaraderie, and bring others along. So the hope is that when you feel like you see somebody in your organization who is doing this because they're resisting change, or you believe that that's that initial view, remember, you can empathize with them, can categorize it as active, passive, or constructive. And once you know where they stand, there are some tools you can use to exercise. Exercise that ability to move them from a challenger to a champion for change. I hope you've been able to find some really interesting tips here. I look forward to answering your questions, and I'll hand it back over to Sarah.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Pritchett. I really enjoyed your talk today and the arm crossing exercise. I had never thought about that before. As Lynn mentioned, I'm Sarah Abrams, and I'll be moderating the Q&A today. As we prepare to dive into questions, I would like to remind you how you can see more from McCombs and Katie Pritchett. Just reach out to Texas Executive Education with any inquiries. We do expanded sessions like this in a private setting, and we also offer open enrollment courses. There will be a link in your follow-up email as well with the recording to the session. Next week, we will be taking a break. I hope everyone enjoys a Memorial Day weekend, but we should be coming back with a new speaker the week after. We're going to go into our first question now. All right. What are tools to manage up when you're trying to initiate and open the conversation to change, but you're not in a position of power?
Thank you. So managing up, I get this question often, and what I see is that some of the exact same tools can work. It just has to be moved in a different direction. So using clear and open communication, using the proper channel that you know that your manager or leader is actually hearing and understanding, using data, and telling a narrative and a story. the goal is for any manager or leader to see you in that constructive light, that you are being, that you have that constructive approach, that you are someone who can identify clearly where there could be some breakdowns, and that you want to help do something about it. So the tools actually work both ways, vertically in alignment. Storytelling, very powerful. Data, very powerful. And then make sure you're communicating it in the proper channel. Thanks, Sarah.
Yes, all right. The next question is, isn't it possible that fear of failure is a root anxiety of resistance to change? Could corporate culture be a barrier by creating intolerance of failure and trying something new? A little bit of a loaded question there.
Actually, I was going to ask if you could repeat it. I heard the fear and anxiety part.
Yeah, they're basically asking if the fear of failure is an anxiety to change, and that could corporate culture be a barrier by creating that intolerance to failure for trying something new? Does that make sense? You can.
Yeah, thank you. So fear of failure falls right into the number one reason why people resist change, that it just can't be better. And it shows that brain science that we're in a pattern of comfortability. And so if we fall short of any expectations, that, we can prove that this is not going to work. This could have implications on me professionally. So absolutely. Now, I think the second part of that question, Sarah, was around corporate culture. Corporate culture, organizational culture is so influential in this. If people who have failed or fallen short of expectations in the past have not done well, not been promoted, not kept their jobs, yes, there's a chilling effect. And that is not okay. And that's a very difficult place to be in. So one of the things that I would always ask for those who are leaders and managers is to think about how we reframe failure. When we emphasize that it is worth trying something innovative and falling short of expectations than it is to exist just in this like mediocrity, then that's really tough. That's where we want to see managers and leaders championing this. There are some organizations that actually have put on like failure conferences, especially internally, where people who've fallen pretty flat in some projects go and talk about what went wrong. That allows people to process it and postmortem, and it shows that person's still in leadership or still out there. And so to the extent that you can, as a leader, influence that type of culture and move it away from that chilling effect, that will be so powerful.
All right, we got time for about one more question. So will you discuss the coping mechanisms and addressing employees' mental health surrounding/during change? And then they said, for example, sarcasm can be used as a coping mechanism.
Yes, so thank you. So lots of coping mechanisms, and goodness, we are right in the midst of that type of this time, right? My family, very fortunate, my husband and I, to retain our jobs, but working at home full time with both of us with limited space and a 2-year-old has required a lot of coping. And we all do it in different ways. So what I will say is any organization that has an employee assistance program should definitely leverage it, and those who don't have it should look at best practices. My colleague, Christy Loescher, did a great webinar through Texas Exec Education on this exact topic, which is why I wanted to answer the question, because I wanted to point you to her talk, because she gives all kinds of amazing tips, way more than I have time to give you here. Sarcasm can be seen as a coping mechanism and as a resisting mechanism. And so if you are someone that tends to use sarcasm, explaining it and being very clear and transparent about it with your manager is important, because then otherwise it could be left to interpretation as active resistance. So great questions. And the other thing I wanted to just quickly mention is I often get asked if managers can prevent resistance to change. And that answer, sadly, is no. We can't prevent it. In fact, just hardwiring for us. But there are things you can do to mitigate it on the front end. And one thing I would love to encourage you to do is, before you start any major change effort, is to spend time getting people to visualize a future state that could be better off and how their lives could be easier, faster, more efficient with this change, that visualization, a pre-mortem exercise instead of a post-mortem exercise, can be very, very powerful. And it can also try to mitigate maybe some of the sarcasm or some of those other side comments or slights that you then see and experience. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Lynn to close us out for today.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you very much, Dr. Pritchett. I have done the cross your arms exercise with you before. I do it every time. And every time it's not any more comfortable than it was the time before that. I keep thinking I'm going to get better at it, but it's not. So I don't know. I haven't measured my arms to see if one's longer than the other or not, but I won't go down that path. But I do enjoy it. And I definitely enjoy the takeaways from your presentation today and how we can apply these things in our everyday lives. I think both on a professional level and also on a personal level. Like I said, going through a lot of changes everywhere right now. So it's really a great timely topic for us to go through this. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the attendees for coming today, spending your time and energy with us. And I did want to also remind you that you will receive a follow-up email, and in there will be a link to the recording if you would like to rewatch it or if you'd like to share it with a friend. So watch for additional information coming out very shortly about our next webinars. We plan on continuing these through the summer and fall, so we're just lining up faculty. As Sarah mentioned earlier, we are taking a break next week for the Memorial Day holiday, but we'll get going again in June. So watch for those to come through, and please sign up for those. Until we see you again, please let us know if there's anything we can do to help, and have a fantastic day.
There's a difference. I want to do it, and I want to be a rock star, right? Like, and that's where you influence people. Like, you know, like I want to do it, but I also want to be the most popular. And so then that person's like, oh, I want to be him, so I guess I'll be nice. Like I want to literally take people who have DNA that's kind of nice and make them more nice